This is the game Cybermorph. If you're familiar with it, it's probably because you've seen the Angry Video Game Nerd episode where he spends 5 minutes playing it and falls into a drunken hallucination. That's this game's biggest claim to fame, as both it and the console it was packaged with, the Atari Jaguar, sold less than 150,000 units. I want you to keep that in mind when I read this excerpt. After playing Cybermorph, I emerge, totally fulfilled, with the strange feeling that after playing video games for 9 years, I had just played the first real one. All 3D, all rendering on the fly, filled with vivid, brilliant colors and detailed polygon enemies that seem aware of my presence. The face of gaming has totally changed. Look at the creativity, the sound, the intelligence. Cybermorph has great music in the intro, but the game itself whispers only the surreal sounds of each planet. The sounds of the approaching missiles, the rumbling of approaching transport vehicles, the hum of your thrusters. That's all you hear, and rightfully so. Music would only interfere. Support? They will have it, because we will all own this system. Atari is back. Come pet the cat.
Where'd you learn to be an asshole?
Now, if I told you that this is a review from a nationally syndicated gaming magazine in 1994, you might chuckle to yourself and say, what, did this guy write this on acid? Wait, that was a joke. Wait, are you serious? The methods by which Dave Halverson was brought into the world are obscure, but in the beginning, there was a mullet. It is likely that he was born around 1959, and at some point got into the business of used car sales. Dave was a shrewd man, by some definition, and possessed an unstoppable willpower. When he had a dream, he would realize it, even if the car he sold was running on empty.
Who dares to enter the Mayhem?
The glimmer of GameFan began as a business Dave ran with his girlfriend Julie called DIEHARD Gamers Club, located in the Los Angeles suburb of Tarzana, California. This was a retail and mail-order store, notable for being a rare gold mine for Japanese import games when it was founded in 1990. In 1992, Dave approached an acquaintance of his, Tim Lindquist, with his goal of turning the Game Club into a full-fledged magazine, after Dave had an apparent falling out with Electronic Gaming Monthly. With gall in his step and a self-admitted naive outlook, Tim agreed, and began working full-time for Dave as a graphic designer. We hadn't agreed on what my salary would be yet, so I told Dave what I'd need to survive, and he said, "Sure, no problem." Then, the next day, he didn't show up for work. Julie came to me and said Dave was deathly ill, and she didn't know when he'd be back to work, so I decided to just start designing sections. At the end of the week, I asked Julie if she'd be giving me my paycheck. She said something like, "Oh, well, Dave talked to Andy, the money guy, and he doesn't want to pay you, so Dave wants to know if you'll take a percentage ownership of the magazine instead, and we'll just give you whatever extra money we can get out of our pockets, like whenever you need some money." Dave would return to work on Monday. Whew! Glad we didn't lose him to that mystery illness. Must have really strengthened his immune system too, because I don't recall him taking a sick day for the next 12 months straight. Making a magazine is no simple task, and setting yourself apart in the market is even harder. But the emerging die-hard GameFan would cut its own way against the competition. GameFan had an attitude no one else could measure up to. It comes bursting out in the visuals that seep from every corner. Check out this awesome intro! Who else would hype up Wonder Dog like that? Some of the graphic design hurts my eyes, but I can't deny the truly different and striking layouts that were present from day one. GameFan was notable for having high-quality screenshots at a time when most other mags were just photographing the screen directly. This could be owed to Tim Lindquist. We started off with some really horrible composite video capture hardware. The quality of shots in issue 1 was piss poor, but I knew from my experience hacking the Genesis and Neo Geo into arcade cabinets with RGB monitors that if I could find a screen capture card with RGB input, we'd be able to grab near pixel-perfect shots and trounce EGM and the others. The new tech caused a frenzy, and you can tell issue 2 is stuffed to the brim with images showing what other magazines couldn't. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's roll back to September 1992, when the first ever issue was being assembled. The staff is 9 strong: Dave Halverson, Greg Off, Maz Kagita, Jay Puryear, Kei Kuboki, Tim Lindquist, George Weising, Julie Anderson, and Dave Winding. Writers, editors, graphic designers, the only thing missing was an artist. George Weising comes in one morning and announces that he was at a game store and met a guy who did artwork for Heavy Metal magazine. Everyone jumps at the opportunity to work with a guy like that, and Terry Wolfinger strolls into the office a few days later. He fibs a little that he's done airbrush before, and they give him a test assignment. On his way home, he picks up a How to Airbrush Guide and Starter Kit. After some practice, he started work on the actual assignment. This just so happened to be the weekend he was scheduled to go sand-wheeling with his family. As luck would have it, my first day out riding, I get a piece of sand caught in my eye and scratch my cornea all up to hell. After coming back from the hospital, I now have to complete my 3 projects with an eye patch on. Arrgh. So what else can go wrong? Well, I managed to make it through, and the 3 projects came out surprisingly well. The rest of the staff were busy with their noses to the grindstone to get the first issue done by the deadline. As Terry returns Monday morning with the finished work, they look it up and down, decide he's right for the job, and add, "Hey, we're gonna need the cover, by, tonight." Terry frantically pulls an all-nighter to get the piece done, and delivers it to the office just as the sun is coming up. With his eye patch still on, he begins the drive home, and falls asleep at the wheel. I changed a full lane on the freeway before waking back up and nearly hitting a motorhome, and that was the beginning of my GameFan career. These early issues were printed at Tim's former employer, TV Fanfare in Valencia, California. Jay would drive around in his pickup truck and give copies away to whoever would take them. These humble beginnings are a good indication for the vibe of GameFan. By issue 3, they'd been picked up by a publisher for national distribution, but a certain garage band style stuck for its lifetime. Nintendo Life interviewed a few former GF staffers in 2021, and one of them, Molly Patterson, had this to say. Writing for GameFan was like having a conversation about video games with a friend, where you'd gush about the latest game you'd played that they really needed to also try, or have fun trashing some new title that was just a piece of junk. While the staff was a huge assortment of people from very different backgrounds, nearly everyone who worked there had that same passion for gaming. Working there also helped cement beliefs I still hold to this day, such as how games should always be judged on their own merits, or how those of us in the media should always strive to be at least moderately skilled in as many genres as possible. The Die Hard wasn't for nothing. In later years, the magazine would adopt the tagline, "The Last True Enthusiast Magazine." It was by gamers, for gamers. Staff members would go by pseudonyms that came with exaggerated characters drawn by Wolfinger himself. They had names like Tom Slick, Glitch, and Nightmare. Halverson's character, E-Storm, was always depicted with his trademark mullet. Around the office, Dave would be known as 1090. 10% in the front, 90% in the back. Wolfinger also illustrated a comic that would appear frequently called The Adventures of Monitor, starring the magazine's mascot. At a time when more and more gaming mags were turning towards cleaner, more minimalist designs, GameFan was blasting you with text and images crammed into every inch. We were young and crazy, but also had a passion for this magazine we loved. In these early days, Tim would do very little writing, as he and George were the only ones on the staff who actually knew how to type. This meant that the writers would stand around the two of them at their computers and dictate their reviews like medieval lords. When reflecting on their time at GameFan, many of the contributors choose to appreciate the good over the bad, but there was bad, and its root was Dave Halverson. The story of Halverson and the antics under him is long and winding, much of it recollected in various forums by former staff. Thankfully, this history has been condensed into a single page on Hardcore Gaming 101 by, hey, it's you! John Shaponiuk. I pronounced it right this time, I hope. Many years later, in a forum populated with several GameFan alumni, Dave appeared to promote another project of his, only to be lit up by Eric Patterson, known in the magazine as Shidoshi. Halverson had a reputation for acting unscrupulously. Eric claims he threatened to fire him because he'd dyed his hair, deeming it unpresentable when Eric wasn't the one meeting with representatives in the first place. More accusations were added that Dave would give or take credit for writing, steal packages, and give game copies meant for staff to friends and family. At one point, there was a four-way power struggle between some staffers, which resulted in three of them ganging up on one, named Greg. They told Dave that Greg had been stealing merchandise from Game Club and had a stash in his apartment. One of the people in this cabal happened to be Greg's roommate, so Dave tells him to give them the key, and then Julie and one other person go to raid Greg's apartment while Greg is out. When Greg got back to the office, he found almost all of his earthly possessions rifled through and strewn about, with many of them missing. It turns out he was completely innocent, and he never got back a lot of items that had personal value to him. There was a general lack of care in the office. One infamous story began when they received an early review copy of Resident Evil 2. It got into the hands of one Andrew Cockburn, who, no pun intended, burned it. 2 days later, the president of Capcom Japan finds out that there's a copy of the game floating around somewhere in Southern California, and he is not happy. They track it down to a used game store and find out that it was a review copy meant for one very specific publication. Federal marshals raid the GameFan offices. According to Matt Van Stone, known as Kodomo in the magazine, it took 2 years for Capcom to be comfortable giving them any kind of review copy, and when they did, they would be standing outside the room waiting for them to finish playing it. This isn't the only story surrounding Andrew Cockburn, actually. Supposedly, authorities came to the GameFan offices one day looking for him because he had acquired a fake ID under the name Guile, as in Guile from Street Fighter. Because what else? He'd then used this ID to get a passport so he could take a trip to Japan. Sometime later, the police would again show up to the GameFan offices looking for Cockburn's boss. When they met Dave, they asked him whether or not Andrew is, quote, a good, hardworking kid or a drugged-out, acid-dropping nut job. So Dave vouches for Andrew, says, no, he's a good, hardworking kid, and he asks, what the meaning of all this is. Apparently, on his way to work that morning, Andrew had struck a female jogger while he was making a right turn, looking left for traffic. She filed a police report, but because Dave put in a good word for Andrew, the cops just told her that it was her fault, and she should have been more careful. Naturally, this interrogation went down before the group acid trip. Oh yeah, you remember the Cybermorph view from the start of the video? So, according to Tim, the staff had been pulling back-to-back all-nighters, and when Cockburn came into work the next morning, he just so happened to drop some LSD into the office coffee pot. And I'm not talking about the game. I wasn't a coffee drinker at the time, so I didn't really notice anything unusual, and didn't learn what was going on until George started threatening to murder Cockburn. This was actually a regular occurrence. The all-nighters, not the acid. See, Dave had this really interesting management style where he wouldn't let anyone do anything until he told them to. Now, this wouldn't be so bad if he didn't wait 2.5 weeks or more to start handing out assignments every month. So games would come in for the month, and Dave would spend his time playing them in his office and doing whatever, while everyone else did pretty much the same thing amongst themselves. Then, when he was good and ready, he'd tell everyone what they had to do, and to make sure that the games he liked got top billing that month, while the other staff would work feverishly with often only a week to get the entire magazine ready. And these weren't short affairs either. Lots and lots of these issues are close to or over 200 pages. A good portion of that is ad space, but still, that's a lot of content to fill. The bad planning led to work regularly coming in late, which delayed the printing, and now late fees start rolling in from the printing company, and these would build up and up and up, and then Dave would just drop them like a rock and jump to another one. Eventually, not a single local printer would take them because their reputation was so bad. I don't know if Dave skipped his payments because he was cheap or because they were broke, but either way, the poor management extended to the company's finances as well. Tim Lindquist recalls that Halverson began hunting for investors only 6 or 7 months into the magazine's life. The revenue from ads wasn't cutting it, and the original investor, a guy named Andy Fell, was losing money. Dave reached out to everybody, including employees and their families. According to Tim, he got at least 3 people to invest somewhere between $50,000 and $60,000. Wolfinger claims that his own father invested $30,000 alone for a profit-sharing percentage that never happened. Don't think for a second that Dave Halverson was not living it up, mind you. None of those investors ever saw a single dollar back from him, but Dave did show up on a brand new motorcycle paid for in cash. In Terry's words, how does one sleep at night doing the shit he did? In 1996, GameFan was purchased by a publisher called Metropolis Media, owned by a man named Dave Bergstein. Another Dave. Perfect. Magazine publishing can be a notoriously shady business. See, publishers make money off of sales to stores and news racks. The sale of the book itself goes to the actual store. This leads to a lot of opportunistic businessmen who want to get in, push as much product as possible, and get out. Bergstein was no different, and his arrival on the scene signaled a change in the way that people got paid. I'll let Shidoshi explain. What would happen is, as payday was a day or two away, we would call the bank to see if there was money in the back to actually make the paychecks worth something. It was pretty sad that we knew by heart the phone number for the bank and the account number for Metropolis Media. Maybe twice a year on payday, the full amount to pay everyone was in there. More often than not, there would only be about half of the required amount in there. The moment checks were handed out, everybody would run out to their cars and Cannonball Run style race to the closest branch of that bank to cash the checks. If you got there too late, you were out of luck. The remainder of the money to cover the paychecks might come the next day, or it might not come for a few days. I think once or twice it even took a week or so to get in there, if not longer. There were times, though, that no money was in there at all on payday, so everybody in the office simply had worthless pieces of paper. We'd then have to just call every day to find out when we could actually get some money. When the feds raided the offices for Capcom, Shidoshi assumed that it was an IRS audit, which is not shocking at all. This herky-jerky financial management would be the breaking point for some of the original members of the GameFan lineup. One of the people Dave managed to con into investing was a beauty salon owner by the name of Elaine Shings. Tim mentions a rumor that she put in as much as $70,000, but he doesn't know for sure. Regardless, she put in a lot of money, and she wanted a position as office manager and control of the checkbook. At this point, the staff was racing to the bank while Dave bought fancy new neon signs and custom embroidered jackets, so the idea of having someone new at the helm of the finances was reassuring. Well, no more than 2 or 3 weeks after Elaine started working in the office, Jay came round to tell everyone not to cash their paychecks quite yet. He said that Halverson had broken into Elaine's desk, taken the checkbook, and bought a 3-foot Sonic the Hedgehog statue with the payroll money. So we should wait until Elaine said it was okay to cash checks. This was not the first time he would do this. A later employee, known as Waka, recalls an instance where nobody was paid for 3 months at a time, while the Daves were cashing their checks first. I remember when Halverson got into Jay's office to steal his and Julie's paycheck so they could cash them ahead of us. When he was confronted about it, his words were, quote, "I don't care. Throw another body on the fire for all I care." Well, when the 3-foot Sonic statue incident happened, Tim, quote, got the sinking feeling that Halverson was the devil himself, and I had better tie up some loose ends that had gone unresolved for far too long. If you recall, Tim Lindquist was promised a percentage ownership in the company when they couldn't offer him a paycheck. Well, Andy, the original investor and money guy, was supposed to draft up these papers and everything would be taken care of. A few months pass and no papers. Tim asks Dave about it, and Dave says, "Oh yeah, he needs lawyers for that. It's a slow process. Don't worry about it. Don't worry." Do you see where this is going? This song and dance goes on for about 12 months when the TFSS incident happened, and Tim rightfully gets suspicious about where all the money is going. He starts asking around and writing down what he hears, and he finds out that if you added up everything that Dave promised to everyone, he had given away over 100% of the company. Tim calls up Andy himself, who he's never talked to before at this point, and asks him about this supposed ownership stake. He was like, "Huh? WTF are you talking about? Dave never said anything to me about you owning anything. There ain't nothing left for you to own." So I thanked him politely and immediately called Dave. When he answered, I exploded into an outburst of unintelligible gibberish, punctuated by pauses to suck the drool back in my mouth. My wife came and stood next to me and urged me to think about what I was saying. So I repeated to Dave what I had just said in English, that I had just spoken to Andy and told him what he said. And he replied, "What? You're not allowed to call Andy. Only I can talk to Andy." I was so taken aback by his complete disconnect from reality, I just told him that I'd be there in the morning and hung up. The next morning, Tim walks into Dave's office, sits down, and the two of them share an uncomfortably long silence. Eventually, Tim announces that he's resigning, and he gives Dave an ultimatum. Option 1. he can get paid some reasonable amount equal to his supposed share of the magazine, in which case he would be willing to stay on long enough to finish the issue for the month and train his replacement. Option 2, he leaves right then and there. Tim knew that it was deadline time, and as per Dave's poor planning, they needed all hands on deck. Dave was basically forced to concede to option 1 if he wanted the issue to come out at all. After this, Tim did agree to freelance for the magazine for about 4 months, but it just sort of ended up petering out before he was officially cut loose from the company. It was at this point that the first major departure would happen, because when Tim left, he brought a few with him. And this rickety, temperamental car Dave was driving would lose a few more screws.
It's not over yet.
I have a Patreon and a podcast. Look at it.
Here comes a daredevil. Game over.